And it is with this that I would like to invite Dr. Léuli Eshrāghi, Dr. Now, who is a very special member also of the experimenter community in a way, and works across visual arts, curatorial practice, and university research. La LD is the preferred pronoun, so I'm going to go with La. La intervenes in display territories to center indigenous presence, languages, and ceremonial political practices through performance, moving image, writing, and installation. La engages with indigenous possibility as haunted by ongoing militarist and missionary violences that erase Fa'afafin, Fa'atami from kinship structures. La contributes to growing international critical practice across the Great Ocean and North America through residencies, exhibitions, publications, teaching, and rights advocacy. I recall how Léuli invoked the Great Ocean and this very personal relationship with this expansive, broad terrain that stitches together so many of us. Eshrāghi is a board member, a board secretary of the Indigenous Curatorial Collective, the inaugural Horizon Indigenous Futures Doctoral Fellow at Concordia University, and a member of the Space Between Us SSHRC Research Partnership. And there are many more collectivities that Léuli is part of. So welcome, and let's start.
Thank you. Johar, Shubo Oporano, Ilene Itula, Avea Yi Olo Uleo, e Fai Mafufonga Ta Molimoli, Le Fa'ala Poto Potonga, Tangata Maui, o Mandwa Makolkata, e Fa'atalofa Atu Mafa'afeloa Yatu, Le Pa'ia Malemamalu Le Aso, Tato Malo Fa Alongia, I Maisi Le Pa'ia Malemamalu, o Le Neitayao, Ifanua Atangata Maui, o Aranda, Masantal, Garo, Munda Makuruk, Malo Le Soifua Manuia. To the Aranda nation whose occupied country I speak from today, and to the Santal, Garo, Munda, Kuruk, and other indigenous peoples whose ancestral territories straddle West Bengal and Bangladesh, I recognize your indelible relationships to and governance of land and water, and bring my Samoan, Persian, and Cantonese ancestors' teachings of good conduct and peace to this gathering. Dhanyavad, Priyanka and Pratik Raja, Natasha Jinwala, the tireless experimenter team, and the Israeli Council for the Arts for supporting my digital return in the Hub's 10th year. Since I last visited Kolkata and Dhaka for the first time in the Experimenter Curators Hub in July 2018, and in the Sovereign Words Indigenous Art Curation and Criticism Residency at Dhaka Art Summit with support from Office of Contemporary Art Norway, Artspace Sydney, and Australia Council for the Arts in February 2018, much has changed. I will share some reflections on my curatorial practice, on changing conceptions of foundational form ideas, and collaboration as relational future building. This work straddles the making of exhibitions, the advocacy for Indigenous and other racialized artists, curators, arts workers, and art histories, and the wordsmithing of text publications in dominant languages. I begin with a deep awareness of the constant grief and assailing intersecting violences brought to boiling point for years on end before this year of pain and tribulation. I begin with a poem dedicated to my recently departed artist grandmother, Mano Natia Fa'ase'etautua, from the villages of Lemuenga and Siumu in the Samoan archipelago. Okay, I have to get my images back. Sorry about this. No, okay. Just follow me here. Unfortunately, it's not working. When I think of long language speech, when I think of long language, tongue in French, is when I think of leo, voice, tenor in Samoan. When I know of ngangana, language, speech, I know of mafalfanga, understanding, grasp. What does it mean to gather together at the foot of giant banyans and ancestor hillocks and mountains, when Sa clans spread, dislocated, dispossessed, confetti of German, British, American empires of the mind and mark, of expending atom, reef, and shoal? Ofuifui fa'atasi a servao ese ese is an enduring Samoan expression that signifies that we have come together from different parts of the forest, bringing our ancestors with us for this digital encounter. And also importantly, the Suli descendants born of Tapuafanua, Atua, and Malumalu, Tangata Nu'u, peoples of villages. Learn these words with me, trying to undo each layer of inherited and magnified coloniality on Suli, seeking to remember, realign many Tapuafanua guardian spirits whose names I don't yet know, from the Lupe Pigeon heyday before plantations and missions. On Namua Sanctuary Island, debris installations wash up every day from far across the heating sea. Pe'a, Laumei, Pa'a, and Manu move and bustle in the land, air, and deep aqua. Humans only make short visits in deference to beyond us kin who care and remain. Love anew the pantheon of Atua deities whose Malumalu pre-colonial temples lie dormant in the rainforest and under church foundations in every village. And more, soft traversing of our lands and waters shared amongst bloodline relations, disputes and all. Tangata Vasa, peoples of oceans. Mai Tina Matua was an artist and expert Failalanga weaver her whole life, supporting expansive networks across the Atumotu archipelago, across the waters, airs, lands, to us children of the Sa, in other people's still sacred territories, in Fanua-based sovereignty. In a matriarchy that is Alofa'anga and Soifuanga from the ancestors, in a binding of far-flung children that is making with the plants of lands we belong to, and the labor of hands, what is denied in the hoarding system of colonizers who never leave our spirits, bodies, systems. Many times over, Tina Matua would reinforce her messages to us cousins in Samoan and English. Remember me, return often, don't take too long. I don't want to be buried already when you do. O te alofa ia te oe tina, ele ngalo oe, ele ngalo lo tato atunu. As I did when I last visited Kolkata, I think it bears reminding that European and European descended peoples' cartographic fantasies and obsessions for containment and extraction of this entire planet never account for deep time relationships of care, reciprocity, ceremony, and creativity. I show you this map so you may know it does not represent anywhere near accurately the epistemic and material homelands I come from in the Samoan archipelago, connected forever as they are to all lands across all seas in the third of Earth's oceanscape we call Vasa Lau Lau, Vasa Loloa, Moana, Great Ocean, and not South Seas, Australasia, Asia Pacific, Pacific, not a pit stop on trips between American and Chinese empires, not at all. A year ago, I visited Lenape-Hoking territories, known as Manahata, for the first time, and truly believed the following words. Like our relational ways of belonging to the fluid expanses, languages, and cultures colonized and undergoing revival, the great oceans, indigenous knowledges, and peoples will outlive colonial capitalism's climate apocalypse. Nothing to do with European seafarers who heralded the times of disease, enslavement, germ warfare, nuclear testing, fossil fuel mining, and unending massacre. Magayench, Cook, Bougainville, Flinders, Dumont d'Urville, Tasman, Vancouver, Da Gama. I don't know if the same rings true. Now, that sense of defiant optimism has been tempered by the very real intersecting violences that the COVID-19 pandemic, climate destruction, white supremacy, and colonial hoarding render most urgent. The present and future of indigenous time and space in our region will not be defined by cis Caucasian men, nor their ways of thinking and being in the world, originating from a small far-flung region called Europe, Our worlds will be realized by us, multi-gendered, sensual, spiritual beings committed to renaissance, balance, and undoing all the traumas, that which is necessary and vital for us to live and love in heterogeneous, indigenous, and melanated brilliance and complexity, in relationships with habitat and sky, water, land, creatures who must have futures for us to also. I carry 2 passports, one from the German and New Zealand created state of Samoa, and another from the settler colony of Australia. This year, I found myself remaining in Australia at the onset of the global lockdown and unable to return in person to my postdoctoral fellowship with the Initiative for Indigenous Futures at Concordia University in Montreal, Canada. This year has been an exercise for me in increasing computer-based labor across time zones. Still, with the neoliberal federal government attacks on universities and arts organizations in Australia, the majority of my work, in addition to my postdoctoral fellowship, comes from Canada. Since late July, I live in a small settler colonial town called Alice Springs, set amongst Aranda Nation sacred sites, known together as Mbandwa. In the last year of my doctoral research, in Indigenous curatorial practice and ceremonial performance art at Monash University in Melbourne, I brought together a collective of 5 Indigenous curators to develop an international Indigenous exhibition at the Institute of Modern Art, Brisbane. Freya Carmichael, Lana Lopesi, Sarah Biscaradilli, Tara Hogue, and myself met over Skype and in person in Brisbane to develop an artist-centered exhibition titled The Commute, staged from September to December 2018. Our aim was tracing ancestral and contemporary voyages that connect different ways of being Indigenous today, all around the Great Ocean Basin. One of our primary achievements was securing commitments from the Arts Councils of Queensland State, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada for an unprecedented investment in 8 artist practices. We wanted to see our local and international Indigenous peers enjoying much improved conditions for the production, exhibition, scholarship, and dissemination of contemporary art practice. Through networks of migration, trade, and exchange, engendered in both ancestral time and everyday, place and travel become integral to contemporary Indigenous experience. Perhaps we can understand migration, trade, and exchange as forms of community and understand ourselves as commuting cultures. So then commuting also requires vigilance of the forces driving our understanding of place and movement today, such as displacement, diaspora, and ecological devastation. The 5 of us termed ourselves visiting curators, to continue thinking through what being a good Indigenous kin visitor is and can be, how we are able to grow in our newer working and personal relationships with each other and with artists from communities where we already had strong relationships. We visiting curators had met at Indigenous Curatorial Collective des Commissaires Autochtones gatherings in Whitehorse, Northern Canada, at friends' barbecues in Brisbane, and at residencies in Auckland, New Zealand, and Banff, Canada. Gunantana artist Lisa Healy and I regularly met to swap words of Tinatatuna and Ngangana Samoa languages that we'd learned, and the Tokpisin in English that we already spoke fluently, and to exchange ideas and understandings, particularly as we were both graduate students at the time. I accompanied the development, production, and exhibition of her major work, Sisterhood Lifeline, which engages with the impacts Eurocentric cultural institutions, public, non-profit, and private galleries, libraries, archives, and museums have on Black and Brown Indigenous women and non-binary folks in Australia, and the kinship-based extramural support network that sustains them throughout. We co-authored a multilingual Tolai Sphere, where Lisa and my worlds and ancestries could meet for visitors and Gunantuna communities alike, inspired in part by writing by Zoe Todd and Edouard Glissant, and by all the times we wanted to find glossaries or dictionaries not selectively written by colonizers. Creating this Tolai Sphere meant defining a space and the then present moment in time for Lisa to express how she lives and considers her cultural belonging, outside her homeland with distinct genealogy and lived experience. This was a textual space where Lisa's own fingerprint within the collective whole could be held and kept, where Gunantuna knowledge, history, and kinship were centered, unlike the overwhelming majority of authoritative, academic, religious, and administrative texts written about Gunantuna people and territory by outsiders. Lisa and I navigated shared German colonial archives and the dispossession or displacement of situated knowledges, ceremonial political practices, and ancestral belongings by that administration, the Catholic and Lutheran churches that followed, and the Australian colonizers after them. The commute in 2018 was followed by a 4-person exhibition titled Layover from March to May 2019, led by Lano Lopesi with the collective at Artspace Aotearoa in Auckland, New Zealand. The 2 projects culminated in our major art museum project, Transits and Returns, from September 2019 to February this year, led by Tara Hogue with the collective at Vancouver Art Gallery. We sought to center the artist-curator relationship and rebalance the ways we work in the art sector. We continued our significant prioritization of artist fees, research and production costs, and family travel costs at Artspace Aotearoa after first doing so at the Institute of Modern Art, Brisbane. At the Vancouver Art Gallery, we assembled a more formally conventional group exhibition, which meant that artist fees, production costs, and travel costs were less generous and more diffuse. Across the 3 projects, we shielded the artists from most of the institutional bureaucracy and ensured payments were honored on schedule, that contracts abided by Indigenous cultural and intellectual property principles. In the first 2 projects, we worked hard to secure funding for artist fees of $3,000, production fees of $2,000 to $5,000, and travel support of $2,000 to $4,000, well in excess of what major institutions in both countries provide for group exhibitions. Forces of situatedness and mobility work in synergy and in tension with one another, shaping the multiple ways of understanding and being Indigenous today. Within the Transits and Returns exhibition, these dual realities were explored through themes of movement, territory, kinship, and representation. The resulting presentation foregrounded the creative sovereignty of each artist to determine their own articulations of the world, while also exploring the resonances between them. We were able to bring artists and knowledge keepers from the local Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations into constellation with those ranging from Alutiiq territory in the north to Maori lands in the south, with many island and mainland nations in between. In Transits and Returns, we still had 5 curators working with 21 artists, including 12 artist commissions from the 2 previous exhibitions and 9 existing loaned works. It is important to consider the impacts of either fleeting engagement or sustained relationships between these and other mainstream art institutions in Brisbane, Auckland, and Vancouver, as elsewhere. How much should we demand, and how long until we experience significant improvements in Indigenous and other racialized peoples' presence in governance and leadership after such ambitious curatorial projects? A few months ago, Tara Hogue's Senior Curatorial Fellowship in Indigenous Art ended and will be renewed with its next fellow soon. Hogue's duo and group exhibitions during her 3 years at the Vancouver Art Gallery, including Transits and Returns, have led to the development of an Institute of Indigenous Art, soon to complement the gallery's Institute of Asian Art. Artspace Aotearoa and the Institute of Modern Art Brisbane have both hired more than 1 Indigenous staff member and recruited Indigenous board members prior to and since our curatorial projects were developed and realized within their structures. Both have also realized international Indigenous art exhibitions since, some with settler curators, some with Indigenous curators. We made a conscious choice to create a multivocal publication that would bring together all 3 projects, with conversational texts by David Garneau and Kimberly Moulton, as well as by Kahutoi Merete Kanawa and Marianne Nicholson, alongside a collectively authored text by all 5 visiting curators. We were particularly inspired by Yves Tuck and Caroline Récollet's 2017 essay written in the first person, Visitations, You Are Not Alone, for the Call Response Project, curated and edited by Tara Hope, which speculatively uses text as a battleground for Indigenous visual and verbal languages, as well as epistemic traditions. The 3 curatorial projects were accompanied by gatherings. In Brisbane in late 2018, Loops and Knots was a weaving practices festival of workshops and talks between Indigenous fiber artists in Australia and New Zealand. In March 2019 in Auckland, Traveling Places, a non-symposium, offered warm, informal learning and sharing activities, performance lectures, and again, food. In Vancouver in September 2019, we held the Great Ocean Dialogues in partnership with the Indigenous Curator Collective, Collectif des Commissaires Autochtones, and Simon Fraser University Galleries. The Great Ocean is defined as a relational space by many Indigenous nations. In the Squamish language, it means to cross a big ocean, the roads of our ancestors. In Hulkaminam, the ocean is referred to as outside waters. In Te Reo Māori, Te Moananui a Kiwa is the Great Ocean of Kiwa. In the language of the Yatitutuyaktitini people, the term translates to one ocean. In Gunantana people's language, Tina Tatuna, Nata, means the deep sea. Orienting ourselves toward the open waters, Great Ocean Dialogues began from a generative refusal of the idea that the Pacific is a vacant space, peripheral to imperial power and flows of capital. The 2-day gathering positioned the Great Ocean as both a return to and a reimagining of our ancestral and current connections across cultural and geographic contexts. These were some of our guiding prompts. How can this concept contribute to shaping Indigenous contemporary art transnationally and from Indigenous perspectives? How can we create and sustain networks of support across the ocean? Where do our practices, knowledges, and struggles for sovereignty align, and where do they diverge? And how do we honor our differences when seeking connection? Before I share reflections on moving more resolutely in 2020 into curating moving image and digital media work from Indigenous artists of the Americas and the Great Ocean, including Francophone focus projects, I want to share a futurist poem I wrote this year. It speaks back to us from 2025 and forms part of my recent digital art commission, Awawuli, for the Australian Centre for Contemporary Art in Melbourne. The work aims to animate the thousands of imprinted and hand-painted Samoan barcloth held in colonial museum collections, to see them as mnemonic devices for Indigenous knowledge transmission and artistic assembly through new archives of visuality amidst our diasporic reality. Histories held in languages spoken and visual pulsate between layers of bamboo cotton, river reed, floral bark, and synthetic fibers. Comlines gesture to stellar arrays through sweaty dances. Shimmering crystals and salt, plants and fruits, hold collective malamalama, and back through 9 heavens and 3 earths to Polotu. Genealogical epics whispered by screen light, speculative possible worlds, massaged by tamanu, long-sought bearings in lands subsumed, still sacred. Hand-making renders systemic alibis lightweight, against breadth of knowing, cooking continents, aromas tenderly guarded to ancestor and kin presences. We are not artifacts and objects which are lies in Middle Earth containment. We are not feathers and leather, reparations in Indigenous world balance. We wear rivers of song and verse, an anchor for who is to come, tilting heads, really seeing each other, and you floating through the mist. This hearth to change all prior land grabs and declamations. I became a cousin seed of Ra'yatea in the constellation of this time, desiring freedoms and self-determination beyond regimes and dominations. Images edited, records silenced, languages dimmed, but you know that. Intersectional queer feminist decolonial ways couldn't be obfuscated together forever. Across the skin that nourishes, surpassing empires that didn't last. Those fumbling over surveilled zones have since been subsumed by water time. Building blocks of renewal and pushing back skylines. Those of us yams and taro, thriving on the edges, the liminal homes of deities. bound by waves of Gari-Garang to towns forever named Birranga, Nipaluna, Garmalang, accommodating liaisons as we scheme across captive anguish. Carceral geopolitics used to infuse toponymic curves in cold coloniality. We died many times and mourned, worlding, reaching across, to hold bespecked atoll universes of neighbors, whose shelter in genuine cloths. Beautiful ear of fern buds, laughter, cacao nibs, pétillant naturel, senses. For the One Saltwater season of exhibitions curated by José da Silva and Michaela Tai at University of New South Wales Galleries and Forest Centre for Contemporary Asian Art in Sydney, I curated my first all-video project, titled Oleua Nafua Mai Manua. I was still living in Montreal when I started working on this project, the first exhibition outcome of my postdoctoral research into archiving Indigenous digital art. I was living in Northern Australia in Darwin when it opened in January 2020, whilst making my Sydney Biennale commission from the tropics. The exhibition was an opportunity for me to bring an institution and an audience to consider the body as a territory that is recoverable from ongoing colonization and on the terms of Indigenous visual, gestural, and verbal languages, as represented in the works of artists from Mapuche, Inuk, Anishinaabe, Samoan, Chamorro, Yaktititu, Yaktitlini, Ngapuhi, Banjalang, Ngahitu Faritoa, Dualanja, Barkumuwanga people. I can as an archipelago linking Indigenous moving image works and histories, demonstrating that the horizons we care about are always multiple, always interconnected, and always producing more vibrant, complex culture. I sought for Oleua Nafua Mai Manua to be grounded in and promote Indigenous concepts of relational space-time and futurities that are not colonized by despair, violence, and cis-heterocoded control. I wanted to emphasize that before we can fully contextualize digital visual cultures and moving image practices within continuing Indigenous histories and knowledge systems that significantly predate the European colonial project in the Great Ocean, we have to free our minds, bodies, spirits, and hearts from the colonial structures or whainga whaakolone that keep us contained and held back from ancestral potentiality and connectedness. I wanted to raise the ghosts of forced mass as part of importing web knowledges and visual arts to all of the Great Ocean's Indigenous places and peoples. I wanted to know and support real access to pre-colonial and anti-colonial knowledges from within my culture and share understanding of the learned achievements and struggles of many other First Peoples globally. The 1995 short film Tala Pacifica, Talk of the Town or Tala o le Taulanga, written by Lisa Taluma and directed by Lani Tupu, centered on famed Fa'afafine cabaret performer and queer icon Cindy of Samoa. Presented from late September to late October this year at A Space Gallery in Toronto and online as part of Imaginative Film and Media Arts Festival, also in late October. Samoan Histories, Screens, and Intimacies, Histoire, Écran et Intimité à Samoa, is the first outcome in an ongoing research project to gather the work of Samoan moving image artists, engaging with bodies, sexualities, knowledges, and futurities. Documentation of the exhibition and resources on each artist and their artworks will soon be housed in the Indigenous Digital Art Archive, created and hosted online by the Initiative for Indigenous Futures Research Lab, where I work. As the first survey attempt of the moving image and digital visual culture of the majority diasporic Samoan people, this exhibition contextualized 6 key works from 1995 to 2013 by artists living and working in Auckland, Sydney, Montreal, New York, and Brisbane. It offered the beginning of a cultural context to research, watch, and sense these important moments. In some ways, this project is part of my response to wanting my own moving image work and that of my peers to be seen on our own terms, rather than dependent on Eurocentric ideas of queer or auteur Australian or Canadian art and film. The narrative style and faux 1980s video aesthetic to Fa'afafine artist and poet Dan Talapapa McMullen's seminal 2001 work, Sinalela, presents an idealized portrait of mobility, nightlife, and romance in the American Empire, whether in the islands or across Turtle Island. These two works by Talapapa McMullen and Tupu Enta Uma provide insider perspectives on the lived realities of Fa'afafine and Fa'atama peoples and the important social roles we hold within our communities. These works and the others included in the project demonstrate how we enact Fa'atinonga, the becoming body, which spans performance and kinship, and how we create what I call siapo viliata, or animated barcloth, meaning time-based works, for the purposes of strengthening and innovating our visual arts and knowledges in constellation with other First Peoples globally. Fellow Fa'afafine artist and curator Yuki Kihara's powerful 2012 work, Siva in Motion, she interprets movement phrases from the Tawalunga dance form, almost as 19th century stop motion photographs, in honor of the almost 200 lives lost to 2009 tsunami in Tonga, American Samoa, and the state of Samoa. Here she is the recurring mixed-race Victorian-era Samoan persona Salome, based on an ancestor who appears unnamed in a colonial portrait. Gestures of the Tawalunga dance are made ta, to mark or measure time in beats, and va, meaning the relational space between all things. In artist and designer Chantal Fraser's 2013 work, It Hangs with Rattlesnakes, Snakes, and Rubbish, shot in Central Californian desert valleys, known for high-velocity winds and spiritual forces, she covers and plays with adorning her brown body, just in sight of the Western gaze. Joyous multicolored fabrics that flutter in the shadows of the wind turbine installation she travels through. In artist Angela Tiatia's signature 2010 work, Hibiscus Rosa Sinensis, shot in Rarotonga, she performs a devouring of the hibiscus, the storied flower associated since contact with tropes of the dusky maiden, sexually available feminine body, and Euro-American projections of desire that dehumanize indigenous bodies. This work draws on Mexican writer Enrique González Martínez's 1911 text, Tuércele el cuello al cisne de engañoso plumaje, wringing the neck of the swan with the false plumage, which called for honest poetic expression over European rose-tinted perceptions. Lastly, in poet, artist, designer, and professor of computational arts at Concordia University, Jason Edward Lewis's 2013 work titled The World That Surrounds You Once Your Death, part of the acclaimed touchscreen-based series Poems for Excitable Mobile Media, Lewis processes the language and visuality of indigenous survival, despite centuries of genocide in Turtle Island. Particularly drawing on his experience as a then new father, he wonders about the shame and existential threat to each indigenous culture when faced with Euro-American colonial domination. These colonial places that he terms as culturally and legislatively hostile to indigenous peoples can be bent and switched on screen to display instead the rich cultural geographies that are part of indigenous futurities and possibilities. Finally, I would like to share two special projects focused on indigenous communities in Francophone regions, Quebec, Kanaki, New Caledonia, and French Polynesia. Co-curated with Abenaki and Acadian arts manager and curator Mylène Gay, Écrans autochtones, temporalité et mouvement, special screening program, and the associated subtitled roundtable discussion were also presented in Imaginative Film and Media Arts Festival last month. Écrans autochtones, temporalité et mouvement offered insights into complex, differing struggles for indigenous sovereignty through 11 compelling works from Francophone indigenous communities across Turtle Island and the Great Ocean. Viewers were witness to the strengthening of connections, languages, and cultural practices, despite colonial divisions and violences. Écrans autochtones as a curatorial research project came about through our ongoing efforts to highlight and contextualize the moving image practices of indigenous makers from Abenaki, Atikamekw, Anishinaabe, Maohi, Jehu, Wendat, and Innu communities spanning Francophone colonial contexts, Quebec, Kanaki, New Caledonia, and Tahiti, amongst other territories where rising stars are becoming known. The struggles for visibility and commercial success span not only the visual arts sector dominated by settler Francophone populations, but also the film and media arts sector, wherein Anglophone and Indigenous makers and communities enjoy considerably more airtime and critical understanding on the part of non-Indigenous audiences. When we consider the Francophone isles of the Great Ocean, more often exoticized as far-flung in the South Seas or in the placid Pacific, we often fail to realize that the culturally diverse worlds we may know by the names Tahiti, New Caledonia, Marquesas, are so much more than the sum of successive nuclear, militarist, and plantation colonizations. Closer to the lake shores from where imaginative was shared with the world, the many indigenous nations within the Francophone regions of Turtle Island, most often eclipsed in financing, dissemination, and critique by settler Quebecois cinema, communicate unique worldviews and humor. With Écrans Autochtones, we wished to decompartmentalize the filmic and richly imaged beauty of Francophone Indigenous filmmakers, artists, and communities, a way to undo the barriers of language, access, and cultural understanding facing Francophone Indigenous filmmakers and media artists. We offered this first survey program of recent compelling works as a corrective for Anglocentric erasure. Co-edited with the Indigenous Curators Collectif des Commissaires Autochtones, Director of Programming Camille Larrivée, and published last week in Montréal with Éditions Somme Toute, D'horizons et d'histoire entre création et mémoires autochtones is the first entirely Indigenous edited and authored collection of new and republished French language essays and interviews on Indigenous visual arts and cultural memory ever published. It draws on the Indigenous Curator Collectif des Commissaires Autochtones 2-year Francophone Indigenous Strategic Initiative, the Jojage Project. It has comprised an international Indigenous curatorial delegation to visit art studios across Quebec, 2 artist residencies in Montréal Artist Run Center, Centre-Clark, and curatorial residencies that resulted in 2 of the largest exhibitions of Indigenous art in Quebec at the Musée d'Art de Joliette in the regions and Musée Macquart in Montréal. The ways that our ancestral languages lead us to the movements that are necessary for our very possibility as human beings in a complex kinship system with all beings are key. This pandemic is sadly only the latest of many that have continually reduced indigenous nations in swift traumatic eras of mass death and cultural loss since the late 1400s in the storied places we currently call Asia, the Pacific, the Americas. Like my mentors and guides in Indigenous communities around the world, my curatorial practice is tasked with contributing to artist investment, recognition of Indigenous art histories, and the restoration of Indigenous visual, sensual, gestural, and verbal languages, so that cultural transmission and responsibilities to lands, waters, and kin animals, birds, fish, and deities can be ensured for futures I hope we all deserve. Aimasar hao, Don Novad, Malayanganga Fafetaya, Ya Oto Uma Ilene Fono, Mao Onganu SS Ilalalang. Thank you for listening and being in this gathering from around the world. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Léuli. I have a storm raging around me, so if you hear the rain, ignore it.
Wonderful. We had it a bit earlier here.
I can't help but start with the question of language, lexicons that we need to imagine, invent, distribute as cultural practitioners today to overcome the hegemony of not only the official English tongues, but also just invent, as I was quoting from Ocean Wong, you are a participant in the future of language. How do you respond to that? I mean, it's clear in your practice, but if you could give us a few tools and pointers how you situate yourself within this question.
Yeah, there's an essay by Yamaji, Aboriginal curator from Western Australia, currently residing in Sydney, Stephen Gilchrist, called Indigenizing Curatorial Practice, which I think was in 2013 or 14. And that essay really inspired me to undertake a PhD in curatorial practice. It really made me feel like there could be a place for people like me. And in that essay, he calls for new lexicons, new vocabularies that draw on the knowledge systems and ceremonial and cultural performance and display systems of our cultures to kind of combat the monolithic universalization of European terms. And obviously, I'm very aware that we're meeting in English currently, and I have very little understanding of Bengali and Hindi and other languages of South Asia. But so for me, I've been kind of conscious of this for a long time and wanting to frame my reading of artists' works for exhibition catalogs and just to understand how I'm going to put them into space through terms from each culture. So usually trying to ask the artist, what about these kinds of, are there any kind of concepts that are really pivotal to your work that you would like to share with me that are culturally based or language based? And that has been, of course, super rich. It's really enabled me to share in understanding of each other's cultural baggage that they bring to the space, but also a deeper understanding of the implications of their work. And then in October last year, I created a poster project called Puna'o, which means like resource or like a spring in Samoan, based on the terms that I had workshopped with Samoan knowledge keepers from around the world during my doctoral studies. And this is a PDF that can be downloaded online. But I just thought, I think if I wait around for permission to update Samoan language with terms for installation or curator, things like this, to really try and create terms that aren't about management of a space or budgets, but about serving community through the display of culture. So there's kind of also trying to base it in like a very specific practice of translation that's not just looking for equivalences, but more kind of different practices that are, not really the same as a star curator. Hope that answers.
Thanks. And also it feels as though you belong to a generation of voices that are insisting on certain connections, as you talked about. What does it mean to commute, transit, and return as a collectivity? And really to make these connections with Indigenous practitioners around the world, quite literally. There's a lot of power in that and a lot of potential and hope in that as well. And I'm wondering about the challenges that come with that, and also if you could share again the kind of pedagogy, digital archiving, these aspects of how you're using your own practice to further these intentions, to make them tangential, and I mean to make them to implement them for a bigger community as well as non-Indigenous practitioners who wish to learn.
Yeah, I think, thank you. I think there's, like everybody, we've been moving online this whole year, and the opportunity that provides is that at any given time, the people that you really want to spend time with to learn wisdom, to be mentored by, are usually in front of a computer. So I think there's quite an opportunity in that, particularly with the Samoan Moving Image Project. There will be a second Samoan Histories, Screens, and Intimacies. There'll be a second iteration again in Toronto next year. And I'm hoping to create something like the Sri Lankan Visual Art Archive or similar projects where not just you know, a Vimeo channel where you can go and view all of this work, but essays, you know, biographies on different artists, a kind of a resource, because the particularity of many Pacific people and other indigenous people from around the rim of the Great Ocean, being that majority of us live in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, France, Germany, and a minority remain in the islands. And those islands are, of course, threatened by rising seas and droughts in small tropical places and things like that. So then what happens to the culture? How do we, for me, it's a really important question, because we can learn, say a song that we had for a particular ceremony is lost, but people in Taiwan still have that. So that interconnection helps the healing, and it helps to understand that you're not really alone. Yeah.
Could you share with us about Nirin, the Sydney Biennale, your participation, but also your reflection on this very important edition that unfortunately not enough people could witness, at least from the international community?
Yeah, thank you. I'll just share a screen again so you can see some images. So here are some images of my installation titled Reconnaissance, which means rebirth through the end, the tongue-in-cheek neologism that I created in French. And it had 160 meters of screen printed fabric with motifs from bark-cloth that I've researched in museum collections. And just to understand that in museum collections in Europe and North America. And so other than my grandma being a weaver, there are still many practices that contemporary generations aren't aware of, but that are held in these ancestral belongings in collections. And then there were neon rings, a neon ring, a water pool, as you can see, and push beyond where our pleasure will go today. So this whole space is a kind of emulation of a temple that existed a few kilometers from my family lands in the Salmon Archipelago to the Fe'e, or octopus deity. So I'm really trying to channel a space that before colonization, and perhaps in the future, for queer, trans, indigenous gendered people to feel at home, to feel safe. And so I worked with 3 really amazing performance artists in Sydney, and we created a live performance that lasted 20 minutes and was on purpose for us and for the ancestors, but there was a crowd there, but I didn't let anyone take any based on that performance beforehand. So this is another view, and that I think is really, it was really rich. And also for me, like I grew up in Australia and I was living in Canada, and so the opportunity to make a really large work for the context that really kind of created me, besides also living in Samoa as a young person, that was really important. Nirin, Brooke Andrew, I know really well. He was one of my PhD supervisors, the associate supervisors, and the project, the biennial really brought so much that needed to be said in an Australian context where white supremacy is really entrenched in art institutions, and a Eurocentric kind of amnesia of Asia existing, of Great Ocean existing, of indigenous cultures of Australia existing, and all different kinds of intersectional experiences existing. It was such an important platform for that to be voiced, and really, really rich works, that some of which are for the land, are for the sea. And there is a Google Arts and Culture platform for the entire biennial, so you can still go in there and see images and some videos and some talks and things. Like all of the biennials and triennials that have gone digital this year. It was really special, and of course, it was a bit sad that that such a lot of work became kind of stalled by everyone going into lockdown. Such a surreal feeling in March. Yeah.
There's 2 questions. I'm going to personally preface, find slightly problematic. I'm going to read it as is. Isn't the very concept of indigeneity premised on others moving to a place that makes people there indigenous? If that right, isn't circulating indigenous art in the global art market, doing a PhD, etc., isn't this participating in the very displacement you're trying to critique?
I think that's a position of perhaps not fully understanding the complexity of indigeneity today. And an example of why circulating indigenous art globally is important and has really interesting kind of reverberations is the exhibition of Gondi and audition art from parts of indigenous communities across the Indian subcontinent in the Asia Pacific Triennial of Contemporary Art in Brisbane a few years ago, and where artists from those communities in India, because of the treatment of Adivasi peoples and the caste system, don't necessarily have access to you know, mainstream kind of visual arts platforms. That exhibition and that opportunity in Australia had other exhibitions that, and their work was acquired, and they could also be in conversation with Indigenous artists of Australia, of other Asian and Pacific contexts as well. So I think there's quite a lot of, I think what I'm trying to say is that the point of working through these knowledges and subjectivities through academic research, through curatorial practice, whichever, is to return to a land-based knowledge. And all humans have always, you know, many people, especially in the Great Ocean, have always been voyagers. So you can be situated in an island, but you can still travel. I think this idea that you're not allowed to travel and that if you travel, you cease to be where you're from is an essentialist European idea. I don't think that it's necessarily from cultures of the world, because things are always in flux. Yeah, I hope that makes some sense.
And how do you navigate aspects of, say, what extractive knowledge of indigenous communities through your own work, or as a witness to those who are working with these communities in the contemporary arts? Slightly amended version of the question.
So I am indigenous from the Solomon Archipelago. That's a position that that I, you know, I'm very honest about. I'm not indigenous to Australia, from where I'm speaking, or from Canada, where I work and where I live, or from when I come to Calcutta or to Dhaka, anywhere. And, you know, there's a very specific territory that I am linked to, but through that connection, it enables me to understand other people's connections to their territories. Not all experiences of colonization are the same. Some genocides are continuing currently, such as West Papua, and others have taken a different, more symbolic or structural approach, where it's not outright warfare every day, but you know, a lot of systems that kill people and that destroy land and life. So there's that kind of positionality that I'm always very aware of, and I think it doesn't mean that Indigenous curators are not fallible. For sure, can make many mistakes, and I think communicating, and I guess the emphasis that I was trying to express relationality, and the term in common for Va is like the relational space between peoples, between objects, between animals, and that space has to always be nurtured. So the space of relationship, even through digital means, with all the artists that I work with, and with other curators that I work with as an artist, because I'm also an artist, means that, you know, kind of a check-in, lots of food, lots of sharing, and finding ways to understand where each person is coming from and what they're kind of about.
Here's another question. Could you elaborate on the, say, relocation of indigenous memories, practices, rituals, to that I would add ceremonies, within the realm of the Contemporary Art Biennale, and how to secure these from the specter of exoticization or of, you've spoken about this before as well, and I would sort of add to that, also, what are the codes that remain private or secret, and what is it that is exposed to a larger audience? How do you...
Yeah, and I think just an example of that is the performance work with Tommy Misa, Kilia Pahulu, and Saraima and Dimate. The four of us created a performance work over 2 weeks of workshops, and that performance was what was live. And so I think creating the conditions along your own, where you're comfortable with yourself was really important for me to make sure that we were wearing lingerie from a lingerie sponsorship. We had custom hand-printed, screen-printed textiles that I had been making in the studio, but we were wearing them as sarong longi, and that, I really didn't want people to be able to take a video or to take photographs. And so there's like one that I've seen that circulated on Instagram, and I told my friend to take it down because the spirit of it was like, unlike this, which is recorded, I wanted people to be really present. And they're lucky that they got in the space. And then it was a cold day for February, very wet and rainy, and we pretended that the water in the middle that we were in was really warm. But another thing, I think a lot about what we demand of audiences, and I have conceptually been thinking about like performances where you ask the audience to take off an item of clothing, not just to take off shoes, but to take off an item of clothing. And that kind of parti pris, that means that people have something on the, have to give something to enter into something. There's a bit of a reciprocity, a relationship there. Definitely, also because Brooke is a Wiradjuri man, an indigenous man, and the way that he brought his parents and his wider community to kind of really culturally support and keep the biennial in a very particular way. It wasn't like other experiences of biennials as visitors, I think, and it really, because the team, also the biennial organization, let him do a lot of cultural things that wouldn't necessarily happen otherwise. So I think there's also, depending on the space, whether it's culturally safe for that kind of change to happen.
Thank you so much, Léuli. There are more questions. We can take them also as part of the informal discussion that will continue. Really appreciate what you have shared with us today.
Thank you so much.